Two giant reservoirs in the American Southwest are drifting toward another dangerous summer, and this time the anxiety spreading through the Colorado River Basin is tied not only to drought, shrinking snowpack, and decades of overuse, but also to a climate signal forming thousands of miles away across the Pacific Ocean. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the massive engineered reservoirs that help transform deserts into modern cities and agricultural empires, are once again approaching levels that federal forecasts describe in increasingly stark terms. At the same moment, growing discussion around a possible super El Niño is raising an uncomfortable set of questions. Would a powerful warming event in the Pacific Ocean rescue the Colorado River Basin with heavy winter storms, or would it arrive too late to prevent operational crises at the dams? Would stronger precipitation even reach the right watersheds? And after years of declining runoff efficiency, hotter soils, and evaporating snowpack, can a single wet cycle still reverse structural water losses across the Southwest? Those questions are no longer confined to climate research circles. They now sit at the center of a widening struggle over electricity generation, urban water security, interstate river agreements, agricultural survival, and the future stability of one of the most important river systems in North America. Federal projections released through the United States Bureau of Reclamation continue to warn that Lake Powell may approach or even fall below minimum power pool elevations during the coming operational cycles, while Lake Mead remains under pressure despite temporary rebounds produced by earlier wet winters. The scale of those reservoirs is difficult to fully grasp until their numbers are placed in physical terms. Lake Mead, created by Hoover Dam along the border of Arizona and Nevada, is the largest reservoir in the United States by capacity. Lake Powell, formed by Glen Canyon Dam between Utah and Arizona, ranks second. Together they function as the central storage system for the Colorado River Basin, a river network supplying water to roughly 40 million people across 7 American states and parts of Mexico. The river also supports major agricultural regions producing winter vegetables, cattle feed, and fruit crops that reach grocery stores across the continent. Hydroelectric facilities at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam generate electricity relied upon by millions of homes and businesses throughout the Southwest. For decades, the reservoirs were viewed as monumental symbols of engineering stability. Their enormous storage capacity was supposed to buffer the region against drought cycles common to the American West. Yet the modern crisis emerged from a collision between rising demand and a river system carrying less water than 20th century planners once assumed. The Colorado River Compact and later allocation agreements were designed during unusually wet periods that overstated the river's long-term average flow. Population growth accelerated across Arizona, Nevada, Southern California, and the interior Southwest. Agriculture expanded, temperatures climbed, snowpack behavior changed, soil moisture deficits intensified. By the early 2020 decade, the combined stress had become impossible to ignore. Lake Mead and Lake Powell both reached historic lows during the prolonged megadrought that gripped the basin through much of the early 21st century. White mineral bathtub rings climbed canyon walls, revealing how far water levels had fallen. Boat ramps extended into dry sediment. Marinas relocated repeatedly. Hydropower production declined as water elevations dropped closer to turbine intake thresholds. In some places, long submerged landscapes resurfaced after decades underwater. Temporary relief arrived during wetter winters, especially after strong snow years in the Rocky Mountains boosted runoff into the upper Colorado River Basin. Those gains slowed the decline and slightly stabilized reservoir operations. But recent forecasts suggest that the underlying imbalance never disappeared. Federal studies released during 2025 and 2026 again projected troubling trajectories for both reservoirs, especially after weak snowpack conditions returned across parts of the basin. The operational thresholds inside the reservoir system are highly specific and enormously consequential. At Lake Powell, one of the most closely watched elevations is approximately 3,490 feet, or roughly 1,064 meters above sea level. That elevation represents the minimum power pool for Glen Canyon Dam, the lowest level at which hydroelectric turbines can continue producing electricity under normal operations. Federal projections have warned that the reservoir could approach that threshold during the coming operational period if dry conditions persist. Beyond that lies an even more alarming boundary, commonly referred to as dead pool. Dead pool conditions occur when reservoir levels fall so low that water can no longer pass through the dam in conventional ways. At Lake Powell, engineers have studied emergency outlet works and bypass systems intended to preserve downstream releases, but these systems introduce operational complications and infrastructure stress. Lake Mead faces a similar hierarchy of thresholds. Hoover Dam's hydroelectric efficiency decreases as reservoir elevations decline, reducing generation capacity and operational flexibility. The lower the water level falls, the harder it becomes to sustain power production through turbines designed for higher hydraulic pressure. The crisis surrounding those reservoirs is therefore not only about visible shoreline retreat, it is about the shrinking operational margin protecting a deeply interconnected water and energy network. A drop of several dozen feet may determine whether turbines continue spinning, whether downstream releases remain manageable, and whether emergency measures become necessary. The timing of renewed concern is especially significant because the current Colorado River operating guidelines are approaching expiration. The agreements governing releases and shortage sharing after earlier drought negotiations are scheduled to end at the close of 2026, forcing basin states into increasingly tense negotiations over future rules. Upper basin states, including Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, argue that they already consume less than their legal allocations and resist mandatory reductions tied to downstream demands. Lower basin states, including Arizona, Nevada, and California, insist that declining flows require measurable conservation commitments from all parties. The federal government has repeatedly warned that without new agreements, the system faces escalating operational risk. Into that already unstable environment enters the growing discussion surrounding a potential super El Niño. El Niño is part of a larger climate pattern known as the El Niño Southern Oscillation, often abbreviated as ENSO. During El Niño conditions, unusually warm sea surface temperatures develop across the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. Those temperature anomalies alter atmospheric circulation patterns around the globe, affecting rainfall, drought, storm tracks, and seasonal weather behavior across multiple continents. Historically, stronger El Niño events have sometimes delivered wetter winters to portions of the southern United States, including parts of California and the Southwest. Some of the wettest winters on record in California occurred during major El Niño years, including the 1982 to 1983 event and the 1997 to 1998 event. Because the Colorado River Basin depends heavily on mountain snowpack accumulation, any signal suggesting enhanced winter precipitation immediately attracts attention from water managers. Yet the relationship between El Niño and Colorado River recovery is far more complicated than popular assumptions often suggest. The basin itself spans enormous geographic diversity. Snow-feeding Lake Powell primarily originates in the Rocky Mountains and upper Colorado Basin regions, not simply in the lower deserts of Arizona or Southern California. Some El Niño events favor southern storm tracks while bypassing critical headwater basins farther north. Even when precipitation increases, warmer temperatures may reduce snow retention or accelerate evaporation. Dry soils created by prolonged drought can absorb meltwater before it reaches rivers and reservoirs. Runoff efficiency, the percentage of snowmelt that actually becomes streamflow, has weakened during hotter decades across the American West. That means a strong El Niño does not automatically translate into reservoir recovery. Recent online discussions and climate speculation have increasingly referenced the possibility of a super El Niño developing during the 2026 to 2027 cycle, though forecasting uncertainty remains substantial during spring transition periods. Even if an unusually powerful El Niño ultimately forms, reservoir forecasts indicate that timing may prove critical. Lake Powell's projected operational stress could arrive before major winter precipitation from a later climate cycle fully materializes. Some federal forecasts already indicate the possibility of minimum power pool conditions before the following runoff season. That temporal mismatch exposes a central problem facing the Colorado River system. The reservoirs are no longer operating with the large safety margins that once allowed managers to comfortably absorb several poor years in succession. Instead, they are functioning closer to infrastructure thresholds where even modest hydrologic disappointments carry major consequences. Hydropower represents one of the clearest examples of those consequences. Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam were designed not only for water storage but also for electricity generation. Hydropower from those facilities helps stabilize regional electrical systems because it can ramp output relatively quickly compared with some other generation sources. Reduced reservoir elevations lower hydraulic pressure at turbine intakes, decreasing generation efficiency. As water levels continue falling, turbines eventually stop operating altogether. The implications extend beyond the dams themselves. Reduced hydropower output forces utilities to replace lost electricity through other energy sources, often natural gas generation purchased at higher cost. During periods of extreme summer heat across the Southwest, power demand surges as air conditioning use rises. Simultaneous reductions in hydropower availability increase strain on already stressed electrical systems. Water releases themselves are becoming increasingly difficult balancing exercises. Holding more water in Lake Powell can help preserve Glen Canyon Dam operations, but doing so may reduce inflows into Lake Mead downstream. Releasing additional water downstream protects Lake Mead but accelerates Powell's decline. Federal managers have already implemented emergency operational adjustments and coordinated releases from upstream reservoirs in attempts to stabilize the system. Those emergency interventions reveal how little flexibility now remains inside the basin's storage network. The political dimensions are equally severe. Water allocations from the Colorado River underpin enormous economic systems across the Southwest. Metropolitan regions including Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego, Denver, and Salt Lake City depend directly or indirectly on Colorado River supplies. Agricultural districts in Arizona and California rely on river water for irrigation, supporting billions of dollars in crop production. As reservoir levels decline, mandatory cutbacks become unavoidable under shortage agreements already established during earlier negotiations. Arizona has already absorbed major reductions under previous shortage tiers. Farmers in some irrigation districts have followed acreage or shifted planting decisions in response to water uncertainty. Municipalities continue expanding conservation programs, wastewater recycling efforts, and groundwater management initiatives. Yet conservation alone cannot fully compensate for long-term reductions in river flow if warming temperatures continue diminishing runoff efficiency. Climate trends across the basin increasingly suggest that the Southwest is entering a fundamentally different hydrologic era than the one used to design 20th century water policy. Rising temperatures intensify evaporation from reservoirs, dry soils more aggressively, and reduce the persistence of mountain snowpack. Earlier snowmelt changes the timing of runoff. Forest stress and wildfire damage alter watershed behavior. Even years with near-average precipitation may produce disappointing river flows if temperatures remain exceptionally warm. Lake Mead and Lake Powell therefore operate not merely as storage reservoirs, but as visible indicators of larger climatic transformation unfolding across the American West. Satellite imagery and shoreline measurements provide striking evidence of that transformation. Marina infrastructure has repeatedly required relocation as shorelines retreated. Recreational boating access narrowed in several areas. Exposed canyon walls display mineral deposits marking former water elevations. Sediment long buried beneath reservoir waters has resurfaced in coves and tributary channels. The reservoir's shrinking appearance has also produced unexpected secondary consequences. At Lake Mead, receding waters exposed human remains from long submerged incidents, drawing national attention to the severity of water loss. Tourism economies surrounding both reservoirs remain highly sensitive to fluctuating water levels. Houseboat operations, fishing industries, marina businesses, and regional recreation sectors all depend on stable reservoir access. Lower water levels complicate navigation and infrastructure management, increasing operational costs and reducing visitor capacity. Still, despite the dramatic visuals, the most serious concerns remain largely invisible to the public. The greatest risks involve water accounting, infrastructure limits, interstate agreements, and the physical mechanics of dam operations under historically low storage conditions. Federal modeling increasingly emphasizes the danger posed by consecutive poor runoff years. The Colorado River system was historically capable of absorbing individual drought cycles because reservoirs stored multiple years of flow. But after more than 2 decades of repeated stress, that buffer has been heavily depleted. Reservoirs that once appeared nearly inexhaustible now operate at fractions of their historical capacities during dry periods. Lake Powell in particular has become a focal point because of its elevation sensitivity. Forecasts warning about minimum power pool conditions triggered renewed concern throughout the basin during 2025 and 2026. The language used in many official forecasts has also grown increasingly urgent. Bureau of Reclamation statements repeatedly emphasize the need for robust operational agreements and immediate action to stabilize long-term basin management. At the same time, the science surrounding ENSO forecasting remains inherently uncertain. Seasonal climate prediction becomes especially difficult during the Northern Hemisphere spring because ocean-atmosphere interactions enter transitional phases often described as a predictability barrier. Some early model runs may exaggerate warming trends or overstate confidence in eventual El Niño intensity. That uncertainty creates another layer of risk for policymakers. If officials assume a strong El Niño will deliver rescue precipitation and the event underperforms, reservoir declines may continue unchecked. Conversely, if an exceptionally wet winter does develop, managers must decide how aggressively to capture and allocate any temporary gains while preparing for the likelihood that long-term aridification continues afterward. Because even strong wet years no longer guarantee full recovery. The mathematics of reservoir restoration have become brutally asymmetric. A single dry year can erase gains accumulated over multiple wetter seasons. High temperatures increase evaporation losses from enormous reservoir surfaces. Meanwhile, water demand across the basin remains immense despite conservation progress. Lake Mead and Lake Powell together once symbolized abundance. Their existence allowed cities to expand confidently across desert landscapes because planners assumed storage systems would smooth out natural variability indefinitely. But modern hydrology is exposing the limits of that assumption. Researchers increasingly distinguish between drought and aridification. Traditional drought implies temporary precipitation deficits that eventually reverse. Aridification refers to a longer-term shift toward drier baseline conditions, driven partly by warming temperatures. Much of the Colorado River Basin now appears to be experiencing both simultaneously, cyclical drought superimposed on broader climatic drying. That distinction matters enormously for reservoir planning. Systems designed for temporary shortages behave differently under persistent structural decline. The basin's legal architecture also complicates adaptation. Colorado River water rights were built through layered agreements, court rulings, federal laws, tribal settlements, and international treaties accumulated over more than a century. Renegotiating those arrangements during crisis conditions is politically volatile because every reduction imposed on one region benefits another. Agricultural interests fear devastating economic losses if irrigation supplies shrink dramatically. Fast-growing cities fear future supply insecurity. Environmental advocates warn about collapsing river ecosystems and degraded habitats. Tribal nations continue pressing for recognition and implementation of long-standing water rights claims. Hydropower customers worry about rising electricity costs and grid instability. Lake Mead and Lake Powell sit at the center of all those competing pressures. Meanwhile, meteorology continues operating according to physical processes indifferent to political timelines. Snowpack accumulation across the Rocky Mountains remains highly variable. Heat waves intensify evaporation across reservoirs and soils. Atmospheric rivers may deliver massive precipitation one season and disappear the next. Climate oscillations, such as ENSO, interact with broader warming trends in ways that remain difficult to predict precisely at regional scales. The possibility of a super El Niño therefore functions less as a guaranteed solution than as a reminder of the basin's growing dependence on climatic volatility. A major wet cycle would undoubtedly help. Heavy mountain snowpack could temporarily raise reservoir levels, improve hydropower production, and reduce immediate shortage pressure. Additional runoff would buy time for negotiations and infrastructure management. But time itself has become one of the basin's most precious resources.